Hi, welcome in Felcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim, and I am your host, David McDonnell, here in my home in County Antrim, Michigan, on April the 11th, 2021. This is the second podcast in April, which is the Scottish American Heritage Month, which I think I confessed last week. I didn't know that was even a thing. Because I didn't know Scots and Scottish Americans had an entire month, which is a good thing, but I just didn't know it. Last week I told a tale or two about St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, which led us into a bit about the Scottish flag and the British Union Jack. And as you know now, Andrew, who was one of the original 12 disciples, never set foot in Scotland. But nevertheless, some of his body parts were buried in Scotland. So I'm going to tell you a tale or two, a couple more tales. Some of them involve body parts, but not all of them, about Scotland. Now, I'm often at Celtic festivals telling stories in the children's tents. And I have a lot of stories that are age-appropriate for kids, and I love telling stories to kids. Some of these, truth be told, I probably shouldn't tell this in case festival organizers are listening, but some of my stories actually that I tell to children are actually the same stories I tell to adults at Irish pubs at night, adult only, which are not age appropriate. But I change a little bit of the facts, and I change a little bit of the characters, so the heroine in a story I may tell at a children's festival is a fair maiden. And I'll tell essentially the same story to adults at a pub. But the heroine will be a woman of vast experience. Otherwise, they're pretty similar stories. Some of my stories that I also tell to kids involve a lot of blood and guts. And I don't hold back on the gory details. The stories from the medieval days and earlier involve a lot of gore. And when I do these at festivals, the kids are often in the front row, in the front several rows, and the parents and grandparents are in the back of the tent. And I go through these stories, and there may be a fight, and the warrior will have his arm lopped off, and blood will be spurting out of where his arm used to be. And I can see, as I look out in the audience, I can see the shocked face when I get to that line in the story, the shocked face in the parents and grandparents. And I know they must be wondering, what the hell is he telling this story to our children? But I look out at the kids, and the kids are just in awe. And if I pause, they'll just jump up and say, "What happened next?" Because the blood and the gore in these stories just don't bother children at all. And I recall at least one, I recall specifically one Celtic festival when I had told one of my stories, and I was in a pause before coming up with the next story. And a little boy in the second or third row raised his hands, and he said, "Do you have any stories about Spider-Man?" And frankly, I did not. It's not one of the things that I typically do. But I thought about it a while, and I realized that I did have a story about a spider. And I told it to the kids, and I'm going to tell it to you now. And it involves Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce tried like 6 times to become king of Scotland. And he always failed. Actually, he became king for a brief period of time, but he could not hold on to his kingdom and his kingship title. On his 6th attempt to become king, he was defeated by England's King Edward I. Now, Robert survived the battle, but Edward's army and Edward's allies were hunted for Robert the Bruce to put him to death. And there was a big reward out for the finding and capture of Robert the Bruce. Now, after that 6th battle, Robert was hidden by Angus Og McDonnell, who was of Clandonnell. Angus Og was the grandson of the first Donnell, for which the clan was named. Angus Og was not the chief of the clan. The chief was his brother, Alexander. And Alexander actually allied with Edward I in that sixth battle and was handsomely rewarded by the English king. But Angus Og and Bruce were friends, and they were allies. And while everyone in Scotland was looking for Robert the Bruce, Angus Og hid him, provided him with a safe house or two or three, always a step ahead of the English. For a considerable amount of time, Robert the Bruce was hidden on Rathlin Island, which is off Ireland's Antrim coast. And he lived there in a hut and often hid in one of the sea caves of Rathlin Island whenever anyone came close and looking for him. So Robert became very, very depressed. He was ready to give up his quest to become King of Scotland. But while in that hut, he saw a spider. The spider was hanging from a strand that was stuck to a beam on that hut, the ceiling of that hut. And the spider kept weaving that band down lower and lower and lower till the length, the vertical length of that strand was about equal to the length between the beam he was hanging from and the next beam over. When he got it down that low, the spider began to swing on that strand, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Kept getting his height a little higher each time, and a little higher, and a little higher, till eventually he got it up to the same height as that next beam. And when he did, he reached out with two of his legs. You remember a spider has 8 legs, but with 2 of his legs, 6 stuck to the strand. With 2 of his legs, he reached for that beam. And he didn't quite make it. He failed. But he kept swinging and swinging and swinging and got his height back up again. And he reached a second time for that beam. Touched it, but could not hold on to it. He failed yet again. And he did it again and again and again. And that's not the way I would have done it, by the way. I would have taken that strand down. I would have tucked the strand up with climbing up a ladder. And when I got it up, I would climb down the ladder, move the ladder over, climbed up to the next beam, and tied it to the next beam. But the spider didn't have a ladder. It didn't know how to use a ladder. So he just kept trying the same method, swinging higher and higher and higher, till he could reach the next beam. He had failed twice. Tried it again and failed a third time. Tried it again, failed a fourth time. Tried it again, failed a 5th time, and then a 6th time. Each time he tried to reach that next strand and failed. But the spider did not give up. He kept swinging, getting his height up, getting up taller and taller and higher, until he reached, on that 7th time, he reached the beam across from him. And when he reached that beam, he held on tightly, stuck the strand to that beam. I don't even know how they do that. They probably secrete some kind of liquid, some gluish adhesive. But he stuck that strand onto the next beam. So we now had a strand of his web from one beam to the other. And once he did that, he was able to go back and carry a strand with him and back and forth until his web got stronger and stronger and stronger and able to add to that. So he now had a web capable of capturing his prey. 7 times it took him to do that job. Failing 6 and not succeeding until he tried it the 7th time. Now, Robert the Bruce was sitting on a chair in this hut watching this whole affair, and he was fascinated by it. And he was in awe of the spider, the persistence of the spider, and his skill. And Robert the Bruce took this as a sign. He realized, despite his 6 failures to become king of Scotland, he had given up too early. He needed one more try to become king. So Robert the Bruce came out of hiding. He left Rathlin Island. He went back to Scotland. He raised an army. He fought several battles, defeated his Scottish rivals, and ultimately defeated a much, much larger English army at Bannockburn. And with that, Robert the Bruce became Robert Roman numeral I, Robert the First, King of Scotland, successful on his 7th try. And thus Robert the Bruce, to fulfill this kid's wish of me telling a Spider-Man story, Robert the Bruce is the Scottish Spider-Man. Hey, let me tell you a little bit about Robert the Bruce. He was a descendant of Scottish and English and Norman nobles. But first let me tell you about his middle name, Robert the Bruce. You might ask, what were his mom and dad thinking when they named their baby Robert the? Actually, the is not his middle name. It's part of his last name. His last name was the Bruce. Now, the Normans were from Normandy, obviously, in northern France, and they were led by William the Conqueror when they invaded England in the 11th century. And they took control of England from the Anglo-Saxons, and they were the Germanic people who took control of the land in the 5th century when the Romans left. And the Romans, of course, took the land from the Celtic Britons, who were there a millennium or so earlier. And, of course, the Britons took the land from whoever was there beforehand. And I guess that's the nature of history, one wave after another. But it also explains the English language a bit, because it contains elements of Gaelic and of Latin, and of German and of French. It's a combination, actually, of those 4 languages as they evolved together. Now, Robert's ancestor came to the British Isles after that invasion, and the first one was Adam de Bruce. He was a place in Normandy called Bruce, and it's typically then spelled B-R-U-I-S. Today it's spelled B-R-I-X, and I don't even know how you pronounce that in French. Some of you may be able to tell me how you pronounce that. But then it was pronounced like Bruce. And it's that village in Normandy is on the same peninsula in Normandy as the D-Day landing of Utah Beach. And Adam came into the British Isles and settled in an area of Amundale, which is in the southern France. And he also acquired lands on the west coast of Scotland as a Norman lord. And his last name was de Bruce, D-E, and then a new word, Bruce, B-R-U-S. Now, the D-E was often used as part of a surname to signify nobility. And it was often used in versions of that, often used in most Western European languages. You think of Charles de Gaulle or Ponce de Leon. That D just symbolized, signified that they were part of the nobility. So Adam de Bruce was a noble from Normandy, from Bruce. And his son, who he named Robert, was the first lord of Amundale of Scotland. And there were a bunch of Bruces thereafter, each one a lord of Annandale, and each one called Robert de Bruce. And Robert de Bruce was the 6th lord of Annandale. And he had a son, who he named Robert. Now, why this last Robert, who would have been the 7th lord of Annandale, became known in history as Robert the Bruce rather than Robert de Bruce, I'll never know. And I looked it up. I'm not even sure Robert knew. But I think Robert, evidence is pretty clear. He spoke Gaelic, he spoke English, he spoke Latin, he spoke French. Or at least, the 14th century version, 13th and 14th century version of those languages. And those languages in the British Isles were in the process of merging, forming what is now close to the English language. So somehow in that process, the D, the French D, with D-E, became the English the, T-H-E. And thus Robert de Bruce became Robert the Bruce. And of course, when he became King of Scotland, it didn't matter because he was no longer Robert de Bruce. He was Robert the first Robert, King of Scotland. Now, Robert was depicted in the movie Braveheart, which was a great movie, by the way, but contained many, many historical inaccuracies. For example, while William Wallace and Robert the Bruce were contemporaries in Scotland, there really is no evidence that they ever even met. The movie also depicts Robert as kind of conflicted between doing what was right for the Scottish people and doing what was right for him to acquire power. And I'm not sure history bears that out. I think he was clearly more interested in acquiring power and becoming King of Scotland than anything else. And the name Braveheart, which in the movie sort of signifies William Wallace, the Mel Gibson character. Braveheart was actually a name given to Robert the Bruce, or at least a body part of Robert the Bruce, and not to William Wallace. And here's why. Robert the Bruce died in 1329, and he was buried in an abbey in Fife, in Scotland. Now, his close friend, James Douglas, took Robert the Bruce's heart from his dead body. And I'm not sure that's something I hope none of my friends do to me. Take out my heart before I'm buried. But Douglas did it. And he took Robert's heart with him when he went on the Crusades to the Holy Land. Now, Douglas did not take a direct route from Scotland to the Holy Land in the Middle East. Rather, he went by way of Spain, which was then held by the Moors. And Douglas died in a battle of Tiba, which is in southern Spain. And it was a battle between the Christian Spanish and Portuguese on the one side and the Spanish Moors or Muslims on the other. And Douglas died in that battle. And Douglas's body and Robert's heart were found on the battlefield. So neither Douglas nor Robert's heart made it to the Holy Land. But his entire body, Douglas's entire body and Robert's heart, were returned to Scotland and buried in Scotland. And Robert the Bruce's heart is in the Scottish borders, buried in an abbey at the Scottish borders. So Robert's heart, having been carried into battle, was thereafter known as the Brave Heart. So it's Robert, or at least Robert's heart, which is the Brave Heart, not William Wallace's. So I'm going to tell some more Scottish stories in our April podcast, but I did want to just dedicate this podcast to my best four-legged friend. Now it's going to be personal here, but I went through some personal problems about 13 years ago. They were health-related. I'm not going to get into details. But I got through those issues with the help of my family and some very, very professional and dedicated healthcare professionals. And it was at that time, trying to give me support, that my wife got me a puppy. She got it from a shelter. It's a rescue dog, and she's mainly a black lab, a Labrador Retriever. Although, again, a rescue dog, there's a lot of other things in her DNA. But we named her Kayla Noir. But I just called her almost always either Kayla or Girl. And from the very beginning, Kayla and I were just joined at the hip. I never went anywhere without Kayla, and Kayla never went anywhere without me. And I trained her as a service dog, a therapy dog, and she received all the required certifications as such. And it was a great experience, just the two of us working together when we did that. And she always wore a vest when she went to work. And when she had the vest on, she was all work. She was just focused on what had to be done, what she thought had to be done. I'm not sure she knew what had to be done, but she was focused on where she was and what she was doing. And totally dog when the vest was off. And one of her favorite pastimes was chasing chipmunks and squirrels. But when she had the vest on, Chipmunk could run right across her nose, and she would not pay attention at all because she was still on duty. That's just the way she was. Now, when I retired from practicing law in Detroit, and I moved to northern Michigan, and I did a number of things. And one of them was I drove a bus for a local YMCA camp for kids. It was a camp that I had spent many, many years affiliated with and volunteering for. And it's an outdoor adventure camp. Kids, depending on their age level, they go hiking or canoeing or kayaking for days at a time for the younger kids, weeks at a time for the older kids, and almost always to the wilderness area in northern Michigan, particularly the Upper Peninsula, and sometimes in wilderness in Ontario as well. And my job as the bus driver was to take the kids to the edge of the wilderness, drop them off, and then return days later or weeks later, whatever the trip was set to expire, and then pick them up. And that meant on my bus voyages, half the time the bus was full of kids, and the other time the bus was empty. And Kayla went with me on each one of those trips. And I remember vividly one trip, and it's one I want to recount to you. Kayla and I got up in the morning, and I live on Lake Michigan, so when we got up and I let her out in the morning, she immediately went down to the beach and took a swim in Lake Michigan. We then drove to the camp. I got the bus prepped for the trip, and the kids and counselors were loading the bus. All the while, Kayla was running around camp like a crazy dog, and she actually took yet another swim in the inland lake where the camp is. Then came time to drive up north, and I put her vest on because now it was time to go to work. And I put a cushion right next to where I drove, right next to the bus driver's seat, and she sat on that cushion, didn't move for the whole trip. And we drove north, and went across the Mackinac Bridge, and then along the northern shore of Lake Huron until we reached our destination. The kids were going to go on a week-long kayak trip. So when I got to that destination, I took Kayla's vest off, opened the bus door, and she just took off. It's playtime now. And while the kids and the staff were unloading the bus and getting their kayaks situated, Kayla was running around and, of course, took a swim in Lake Huron. Now, once the bus was unloaded and ready to go, Kayla got back into the bus. It was going to be an empty bus then, so I didn't bother with her vest. I just made sure the window was down on the seat behind me, and she and I drove north to Lake Superior. And I think she had her head out the window, like the whole trip. And what we were doing is we were picking up kids who would spend a week on Lake Superior at the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. They had been hiking there for a week. And when we got there, I opened the door, Kayla ran out, and of course took a swim in Lake Superior. Kids then loaded the bus with their gear. We got ready to go. Kayla came back on board the bus. I put her vest back on her. She laid right down in the seat, or the cushion right next to my seat. And then we drove back to camp. So in that one day, Kayla swam in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Superior, 3 plus an inland lake, but 3 out of the 5 Great Lakes in that single day. Now, when I finished, a few years later, I finished my book, McDonnell, and that's kind of when I started going on book tours and storytelling tours across the country. Kayla went with me almost every single one of them. She marched with me in 2 different St. Patrick's Day parades. I went through my notes. In fact, I got a page devoted to her on my website. I went through that website, and I realized she had been to 35 different states. 35. plus the District of Columbia, and plus Ontario, Canada. And she went swimming in the Atlantic Ocean, and she went swimming in the Pacific Ocean. A well-traveled dog. I'm telling you this now as part of my podcast, and the reason I'm dedicating this podcast to you is that Kayla is no more. She died yesterday. She had a tumor on her liver, and her kidneys were failing, and this wasn't even diagnosed till Monday. I mean, before then, she had been slowing down. I kind of thought it was age, and I thought she was ill, but I wasn't sure what. And finally, Monday, I took her to the vets. And that's when the veterinarian told me about the tumor and the kidney failure. And he also told me there was nothing we could do. And that we'd have to decide how we wanted to deal with that. And frankly, she was not in pain. She was very slow moving. So we decided, you know what, we're just going to let nature take its course. So she spent this past week mainly in her bed. She'd go outside for some short walks, but very short walks. But she seemed alert most of the time, or some of the time anyway, and asleep the other time. But finally, yesterday around noon, she died in her own dog bed, which I guess is the way to go. Die in your own bed, in your own time. So I will miss her, and that's the end of my podcast. But please take a look at my website, clandonald.net, spelled this way. Send a note to clandonald@gmail.com. Please like and share my Facebook page, and like my YouTube videos, please. So I'm going to say goodbye to you now. And of course, goodbye to Kayla. My book to her dog. Bye-bye.